December 18, 1944, 3:47 hours, Stavelot, Belgium. The bridge is still standing. Joachim Peiper stares at it through the pre-dawn darkness, a single stone arch spanning the Bulge River, the last obstacle between his tanks and the American fuel depot at Spa. 4 miles. That's all that separates Kampfgruppe Peiper from 3 million gallons of gasoline, enough fuel to punch all the way to Antwerp, enough to split the Allied armies in half, enough to win. But the bridge is wired. He can see the engineers scrambling on the far side, unspooling detonation cord, placing charges. American combat engineers. They know he's coming. They know what he needs, and they're about to blow the only crossing for 10 miles. Peiper doesn't hesitate. Forward, Schnell. The lead Panther lurches onto the bridge, treads grinding stone, engine roaring. 50 yards, 30. The engineers scatter, 20 yards. Someone pulls the detonator handle. Nothing. The charges don't blow. The bridge holds, and the Panther rolls across, followed by another, and the entire spearhead of Hitler's last great offensive pours into Stavelot like a steel flood. Victory is 4 miles away. The fuel depot is undefended. The road is open. This is the moment. This is where Germany turns the war around. Except Peiper's fuel gauges are reading empty. His tanks are running on fumes. And in 48 hours, the most powerful armored column in the Ardennes will be sitting on the side of the road, abandoned, silent, and worthless, because steel without fuel is just scrap metal waiting to die. 48 hours earlier, the Ardennes had been quiet, too quiet. The Americans called it the Ghost Front, a sleepy 80-mile stretch of Belgian forest where green divisions went a train and veteran units went a rest. No major fighting, no German activity, just snow, trees, and boredom. The generals thought the war was over. They thought the Germans were broken, retreating, finished. They were building plans for crossing the Rhine, for pushing into Germany, for ending the war by Christmas. They were wrong. Because on December 16th at 5:30 hours, the entire Ardennes front erupted in fire. Over 1,900 German artillery pieces opened up simultaneously, hammering American positions with high explosive and incendiary shells. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. And when it stopped, 200,000 German soldiers poured through the forest, 3 entire armies, spearheaded by elite Waffen-SS Panzer divisions, driving west with one objective: reach the Meuse River, cross it, and capture Antwerp. If they succeeded, they'd cut off the entire Allied supply line, trap 4 armies, force a negotiated peace, maybe even win the war. It was desperate, it was insane, and Hitler had bet everything on it. But there was a problem, a fatal problem. Germany didn't have enough fuel. The Wehrmacht had calculated that the offensive needed 5 million gallons of gasoline to reach Antwerp. They had 2 million, maybe. The plan, such as it was, relied on capturing American fuel depots along the way. The Germans would drive west, overrun supply dumps, refuel their tanks with American gas, and keep going. It was a gamble, a terrible, idiotic gamble, but it was the only gamble they had left. And leading the charge was SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Peiper was 29 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a ruthless, brilliant tank commander who'd fought at Kursk, Kharkov, and the Korsun Pocket. He was also a war criminal. His unit had massacred Soviet POWs, burned villages, executed civilians. But the SS didn't care about that. They cared that Peiper got results, that he was fast, aggressive, and willing to take risks. That's why he was given Kampfgruppe Peiper, a reinforced battle group of over 5,000 men, 100 tanks, and the mission to lead the entire offensive. Peiper's orders were simple: break through the American lines, race west, capture the bridges over the Meuse, and don't stop for anything. Not for prisoners, not for wounded, not for resupply, just drive, fast, hard, until the tanks ran dry or the Allies collapsed. By the morning of December 17th, day 2, Peiper had already punched 20 miles into American territory. His column had overrun supply convoys, scattered re-echelon units, and left a trail of burning trucks and dead Americans in his wake. The spearhead was moving so fast that American command didn't even know where he was. Radio reports were contradictory. Units were calling in sightings of German tanks miles apart. Panic was spreading. The front was collapsing. And Peiper was running out of fuel. His lead tanks, Panthers and Tiger IIs, were guzzling gasoline at a catastrophic rate. A Panther got maybe 0.5 miles per gallon. A Tiger II got worse. Peiper had started the offensive with enough fuel for maybe 60 miles. He'd already driven 30. And the American fuel depots he was supposed to capture, either destroyed, evacuated, or defended. The Americans were learning fast. Every time Peiper's column approached a supply dump, engineers blew it up, burned it, denied it. By December 18th, Peiper's fuel situation was critical. He had maybe 12 hours of driving time left, maybe less. And that's when his scouts reported the fuel depot at Spa, 3 million gallons, undefended, 4 miles away. If Peiper could take it, the offensive would succeed. If he couldn't, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the entire spearhead of Hitler's last gamble, would die on the road. Everything came down to one bridge, one river crossing, one moment. And the American combat engineers were about to make their stand. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin didn't look like a hero. He was 30 years old, a civil engineer from Pennsylvania, commanding the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, a unit of bridge builders, road repairmen, and mine clearers. Not frontline infantry, not tank destroyers, just engineers, men trained to build, not fight. But on December 17, 1944, Pergrin's engineers became the only thing standing between Peiper's Panzers and the fuel depot at Spa. Pergrin had been in Malmedy, a small Belgian town just south of Spa, when the offensive hit. Within hours, refugees started flooding in, then retreating American soldiers, then reports of German tanks, lots of them, moving fast, headed straight for the fuel depot, and nobody was defending it. Pergrin made a decision. He couldn't stop the tanks. He didn't have anti-tank guns, didn't have armor, didn't have infantry support, but he had explosives, and he had bridges. If he could blow the bridges over the Ambulve River, he could trap Peiper on the wrong side, force him to detour, slow him down, buy time. So Pergrin split his battalion and sent teams to every bridge in the area. Malmedy, Stavelot, Trois Ponts, Habemont. Each team carried TNT detonation cord and orders. Wire the bridge, wait for the Germans, and blow it the moment they got close. It was a suicide mission. The engineers knew it, but they went anyway. The first test came at Stavelot on the morning of December 18th. Peiper's column roared into town at dawn, Panthers leading, followed by half-tracks crammed with SS Panzer grenadiers, then the monsters, Tiger IIs, 68-ton beasts armed with 88 guns that could kill a Sherman from 2 miles away. The Americans in Stavelot, a handful of infantry and Pergrin's engineers, opened fire. Machine guns, bazookas, rifles. It was like throwing rocks at a landslide. The Panther reached the bridge. Sergeant Gene Miller, in charge of the demolition team, grabbed the detonator handle and twisted. Nothing happened. The primer failed. The TNT didn't ignite. The bridge didn't blow. Miller stared in horror as the Panther rolled across, turrets swiveling, machine guns blazing. The engineers scattered. Some of them made it. Some didn't. And Peiper's column poured into Stavelot, unstoppable, 4 miles from the fuel depot and closing fast. But then something strange happened. Peiper stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because his lead tanks were sputtering, running dry. The fuel gauges were hitting zero. The Panthers were coasting on fumes. If he pushed forward without refueling, the entire spearhead would stall in the open, vulnerable, useless. So Peiper made a choice: consolidate, refuel from the last remaining jerry cans, and resume the attack at dawn. It was the right tactical decision. It was also the decision that lost him the war. Because while Peiper was refueling, Pergrin was blowing bridges. At Trois Ponts, a village just north of Stavelot, another engineer team waited at the bridge over the Salm River. When Peiper's scouts appeared at 1100 hours, the engineers blew it. The explosion collapsed the span into the river, cutting off Peiper's most direct route to Spa. He'd have to detour, find another crossing, burn more fuel. At Habemont, another bridge went down, then another at Neufmoulin. Every crossing Peiper tried, the engineers were there first, wiring, waiting, blowing. Pergrin's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and terrified, but they were winning, not by killing tanks, by denying roads, by turning the Ardennes into a maze where every route led to a dead end and every mile burned fuel Peiper didn't have. By the end of December 18th, Peiper was trapped. The bridges were down, the roads were blocked, and the fuel gauges were reading empty. Peiper radioed for resupply. The reply came back, negative, no fuel available. The supply columns were stuck in traffic jams 20 miles behind him. The roads were clogged with retreating American units, burning vehicles, and German reinforcements trying to push forward. Nobody could get through. Peiper was 4 miles from 3 million gallons of gasoline, and he couldn't reach it, because the engineers, those quiet, unglamorous combat engineers, had turned the rivers into walls and the bridges into rubble. The spearhead was dying, and Peiper knew it. December 19, 1944, Peiper was stuck. Not destroyed, not defeated, just stuck, out of fuel, out of options, out of time. The column sat strung out along a narrow forest road near the village of La Glise, a few miles southeast of Spa. The tanks were silent, the crews were exhausted, and the Americans were closing in. Peiper knew what was coming. He'd been on the Eastern Front. He'd seen what happened to armored columns that ran out of fuel. They got surrounded, cut off, and annihilated. He radioed for help, begged for fuel, for air support, for reinforcements. The replies were vague, non-committal. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, the weather was clearing, and Allied fighters owned the skis. The supply columns were still stuck in traffic. The infantry support that was supposed to follow Peiper had been delayed, scattered, or stopped by American counterattacks. Peiper was alone, and the Americans were coming. By December 20th, elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne had surrounded La Glise. Artillery started falling, not the scattered, probing fire of a skirmish, but sustained, concentrated bombardment. The Americans had brought up heavy guns, 155 mm howitzers, and they were pounding the village into rubble. Buildings collapsed, trees splintered. Tanks took direct hits, turrets blown off, crews killed inside. Peiper pulled his men into a defensive perimeter. He still had maybe 800 SS troops, a dozen operational tanks, and enough ammunition to fight. But no fuel. He couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't maneuver. All he could do was sit and take it. And then the weather cleared, and the fighter bombers arrived. Thunderbolts, dozens of them, screaming in low over the trees, wings loaded with rockets and bombs. They hit the German column like a hammer. Explosions ripped through the forest. Tanks brewed up, ammunition cooking off in secondary blasts. Half-tracks exploded. Supply trucks burned. The SS troops dug in, firing back with anti-aircraft guns, but it didn't matter. The Americans controlled the air. And air superiority in 1944 was a death sentence. By December 23rd, Peiper had fewer than 800 men left, maybe 10 tanks still operational. No fuel, no resupply, no hope. He made the only decision he could, abandon the vehicles and break out on foot. Under cover of darkness, the remnants of Peiper slipped through the American lines, crossed the Salm River, and escaped east. They left behind everything: tanks, half-tracks, artillery, equipment. Millions of dollars worth of armor, sitting silent in the snow, out of fuel, out of war. The unstoppable spearhead had stopped, 4 miles short of victory, because they ran out of gas. But the story doesn't end there, because before Peiper retreated, his men had committed a war crime, one that would haunt the Ardennes for decades. On December 17th, the second day of the offensive, a convoy of American prisoners had been captured near Malmedy. Over 120 men, mostly artillerymen, disarmed and marching under guard. Peiper's column passed them on the road. What happened next is disputed. Some say Peiper gave the order, some say it was a subordinate, some say it was spontaneous. But the result was undeniable. The prisoners were machine-gunned, shot in a field, left to die in the snow. 84 Americans were murdered. It became known as the Malmedy Massacre, and it turned Peiper from a tactical threat into a symbol of Nazi brutality. American soldiers stopped taking SS prisoners. Remember Malmedy became a rallying cry, and when the war ended, Peiper was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death, later commuted to life, later reduced, and eventually released in 1956. The massacre overshadowed everything else. The tactical brilliance, the near breakthrough, the desperate gamble, all of it buried under the weight of that single horrific act. And maybe that's fitting, because Kampfgruppe Peiper's story isn't just about tanks and fuel. It's about what happens when desperation meets cruelty, when a dying regime bets everything on one last roll of the dice, when victory is 4 miles away and fuel runs dry and all that's left is blood in the snow. The Ardennes offensive would drag on for another month, but Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead, the vanguard, the tip of Hitler's last gamble, was finished, broken, out of fuel, out of time, and 4 miles from the depot that could have changed everything. While Peiper's Panzers died in the snow, Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin's engineers became legends. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had started the Battle of the Bulge as a re-echelon support unit. By the time it ended, they'd been awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor a unit can receive, for single-handedly stopping the German spearhead. Not with tanks, not with infantry, with bridges and TNT and the kind of quiet, unglamorous courage that doesn't make headlines but wins wars. Pergrin's men had blown 14 bridges in 72 hours. 14, every one of them under fire, every one of them with German tanks bearing down on them. Some of the demolitions worked perfectly, some failed. Some were blown too early, trapping American units on the wrong side. Some were blown too late, letting the Germans across before collapsing behind them. But taken together, they turned the Ardennes into a maze that Peiper couldn't navigate and a trap he couldn't escape. The engineers didn't just blow bridges, they fought. At Malmedy, they held the town against repeated German assaults, firing rifles and machine guns from windows and rooftops, calling in artillery strikes danger close, holding the line until the 30th Infantry Division arrived. At Stavelot, they fought house to house, delaying Peiper's column for critical hours while the fuel depot at Spa was evacuated. At Trois Ponts, they mined the roads, set up roadblocks, and turned every crossroads into a killing zone. These weren't frontline troops. These were guys trained to build Bailey bridges and clear minefields. But in December 1944, they became the frontline, and they held. The story of the Ardennes is usually told through the lens of Bastogne, the surrounded paratroopers, the desperate defense, the famous reply, "Nuts," and Bastogne mattered. It tied down German forces. It delayed the offensive. It became a symbol of American resilience. But Bastogne didn't stop Peiper. The engineers did. Because wars aren't just won by soldiers who fight. They're won by soldiers who deny, who take away the enemy's options, who turn roads into dead ends and bridges into rubble, who make victory impossible not by killing the enemy but by starving them. And that's what Pergrin's engineers did. They starved Peiper of the one thing he needed more than ammunition, more than reinforcements, more than time: fuel. By December 24th, 8 days into the offensive, the German advance had stalled completely. The weather had cleared, and Allied air power was slaughtering everything that moved. Patton's Third Army had broken through from the south, relieving Bastogne. The British were holding the northern flank, and the Germans, exhausted, out of fuel, out of supplies, were retreating. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, had failed. It had cost the Americans 19,000 dead, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It had cost the Germans 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, and any hope of stopping the Allied advance into Germany. By February 1945, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. By May, the war was over. And it had all come down to fuel, the thing Peiper needed most, the thing he got closest to, the thing he never reached. 4 miles. That's how close Germany came to changing the outcome of the war. 4 miles between Kampfgruppe Peiper and 3 million gallons of gasoline. 4 miles that might as well have been 400, because the bridges were down and the engineers were waiting and the fuel gauges were reading empty. The engineers didn't win the war, but they stopped the Germans from losing it slower, and sometimes that's enough. Years after the war, you could still find them. Abandoned German tanks, Panthers, Tiger IIs, half-tracks, sitting in the forests around La Glise and Stavelot, slowly rusting, slowly disappearing into the earth. Some were recovered, scrapped, melted down. Some were turned into memorials. And one, a massive Tiger II, still sits in the center of La Glise, preserved as a monument. a reminder of the battle, a reminder of the gamble, a reminder of what happens when steel runs out of fuel. Joachim Peiper survived the war. He was captured, tried for the Malmedy massacre, and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted. He was released in 1956, moved to France, and lived quietly until 1976 when his past caught up with him. His house was firebombed. He died in the flames. Some say it was revenge. Some say it was justice. Either way, the man who came 4 miles from victory died the same way his offensive did, consumed by fire, out of options, out of time. David Pergrin went home. He returned to Pennsylvania, went back to being a civil engineer, and rarely talked about the war. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was deactivated in 1945. The men scattered. Most of them lived quiet lives. A few wrote memoirs. Fewer still were celebrated because engineers don't get parades. They don't get movies. They get footnotes. But without them, the Germans would have taken Spa, would have refueled, would have reached the Meuse, would have extended the war by months, maybe longer. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for Bastogne, for McAuliffe's nuts, for Patton's relief column. But it should also be remembered for the engineers, for the men who blew bridges in the face of oncoming tanks, for the quiet, desperate heroism of doing the job even when the job seems impossible, for understanding that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to make sure the enemy can't fight it. And it should be remembered for the lesson Peiper learned too late, that wars aren't won by steel alone. They're won by logistics, by fuel, by supply lines and depots, and the unglamorous, grinding work of keeping an army moving. Germany had the best tanks in the world, the best trained soldiers, the best tactical commanders, and they lost because they couldn't keep their tanks full. 4 miles. That's how close they came. 4 miles in 48 hours. 48 hours where Kampfgruppe Peiper clawed forward, burned through every drop of fuel they had, and died on a frozen Belgian road with empty tanks and nowhere to go. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble, and it failed not because the Americans were stronger or braver or better equipped. It failed because a handful of combat engineers understood that you don't have to destroy an enemy to defeat them. You just have to stop them from getting what they need. And what the Germans needed, what they always needed, what they never had enough of, was fuel. The thing that turns steel into power. The thing that turns plans into victories. The thing that, when it runs out, turns the most powerful armored column in Europe into a graveyard of silent, useless metal waiting for the scrapyard. Peiper came 4 miles from victory, and he might as well have been 4,000, because in war, distance isn't measured in miles. It's measured in bridges, in fuel depots, in the choices made by engineers under fire. And in December 1944, those choices saved the war.